Good morning and a warm welcome to the 12th meeting of the Constitution Europe External Affairs and Culture Committee in 2025. We have received apologies today from Keith Brown and Alexander Stewart. The one item on this week's agenda is to take evidence for the final time as part of an inquiry to feed into the consultation for the UK Government's review of the UK Internal Market Act 2020. Before we begin, I want to state that there is an active court case, Biffa Waste Services Limited against the Scottish Ministers, which is relevant to the committee's current inquiry. Given that the case is currently active, we have sought the presiding officer's permission to be able to refer to the deposit return scheme exclusion process today. The presiding officer has permitted discussion of the policy issues so far as to enable scrutiny while avoiding direct comment on the specifics of the active case. Any reference should be within these parameters, and direct discussion on an active court case is to be avoided. And can I welcome to committee this morning Angus Robertson, Cabinet Secretary for Constitution, External Affairs and Culture, and Ewan Page, Head of UK Frameworks, Scottish Government. And can I thank the Cabinet Secretary for his letter earlier this week and the sight of the response, the Scottish Government's response to the review. And can I invite the Cabinet Secretary to make a short opening statement?
Thank you very much, Convener, and thank you for the opportunity to speak to the committee on the UK Government's statutory review of the Internal Market Act. Before I turn to that, given we will doubtlessly touch on the needs of Scottish businesses this morning, I should start by noting developments overnight. We are all aware that the United States administration will impose additional tariffs on imports into the United States, and this will clearly have an impact on many Scottish businesses for which the United States is an important export market. We do not believe that unilateral measures by the United States are the answer, and we are concerned about the negative impact of trade barriers on the Scottish economy. We urge the United States and all parties to come together and to work towards mutually beneficial resolutions. We greatly value the strong social, cultural and economic ties that Scotland shares with the United States, and we will work to ensure that these continue to flourish. Now turn to the issue before us today. Convener, the Scottish Government publishes its position paper on the Internal Market Act. A copy has been provided to the committee in advance of today's session. The Scottish Government's central proposition in the paper is simple. The Act should be repealed, and it should be replaced with an equitable, co-designed system built around the common frameworks approach. That's also the view of this Parliament, which has voted twice in favour of repeal. As you know, Convener, predecessor to this committee concluded unanimously in February 2022 that the Act can, and I quote, automatically disapply devolved legislation. This is an extraordinary state of affairs. Laws passed in areas of devolved competence by a democratically accountable legislature can indeed have been effectively nullified at the whim of a UK minister completely unaccountable to this Parliament. The new UK government was elected last year on a manifesto commitment to reset relations with the devolved governments, and in that context it's regrettable that there was a failure to even consider repeal within the terms of the statutory review. I remain hopeful that the UK government will acknowledge the position of the Scottish Government and indeed our colleagues in Wales and work with us to deliver an agreed and workable alternative to the Internal Market Act. One of the founding purposes of devolution was to support our ability to diverge on policy in a way that makes sense for the different needs and objectives in different parts of the United Kingdom. The Internal Market Act has created a system which erodes the Scottish Parliament's ability to make devolved policy that addresses Scotland's needs. Its effect has been to diminish the powers and the autonomy of this place in favour of unilateral decision-making on the part of the UK Government. Given the significant problems with the Act, addressing the damage it has caused will require more than just procedural change. It requires a fundamental rethink and the development of a new model of regulatory cooperation that supports the economic growth we all want to see while respecting devolution. The Internal Market Act is an international outlier. The way the Act operates is very different from how well-designed internal market regimes do elsewhere. It has no proportionality. It has no subsidiarity principles, standard features of properly functioning internal market regimes elsewhere. As we prepare to respond to the UK Government's review, my colleagues and I have been considering the views of a wide variety of interests in Scotland. From these discussions, the Scottish Government remains in no doubt of the importance of ensuring businesses in Scotland face no unnecessary barriers to trade with the rest of the United Kingdom. It is equally clear that the Internal Market Act is not a necessary or a proportionate means of achieving this outcome. Indeed, as we have seen, it has the potential to promote regulatory uncertainty, as well as inhibiting productive and respectful cooperation on regulatory policy, which is what business organisations want to see. In our view, common frameworks continue to offer a viable model for a better, more collaborative way of managing some of the regulatory challenges thrown up by Brexit. The system is, however, under strain, as the work of the frameworks can be undermined by the Internal Market Act. The UK Government's consultation document proposes making frameworks the key mechanism for managing regulatory cooperation. The Scottish Government agrees. However, the UK Government has provided no information on how this is to be achieved or how the threat the Act poses to the operation of the common framework system is to be addressed. The Internal Market Act was imposed on this Parliament against its will, without its consent, by the previous UK Government. It must be repealed in line with the wishes of the Scottish Parliament, and this should be followed by substantive engagement on progress towards a sustainable agreed alternative. I look forward to discussing these issues and other areas of interest to the committee, and I welcome your questions, Convener. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Cabinet Secretary. The UK Internal Market White Paper stated that a legislative framework that the principles constitute a legislative framework that will preserve the fundamental market access rights of business and citizens across the UK internal market. The system will replace the effect of the rules and mechanisms of the EU single market and within the UK. What's your assessment to the extent at which UK has replaced the rules and mechanisms of the EU single market?
Well, the first thing I would say, Convener, is that a properly functioning internal market regime looks very different from the Internal Market Act. The way the Act operates is very different from how a well-designed internal market regime does, and it's very, very different from that enjoined within the European Union. It replaces broad legal principles of mutual recognition and non-discrimination with rigid statutory requirements that apply in almost every single case. I said it in my introductory statement, and I think it really, really important to understand that. The Internal Market Act has no proportionality or subsidiarity principles. Those are common features in other internal market regimes. That was the case in the European single market. And so this lack of proportionality, this lack of balance, is a recipe for confusion and uncertainty, and it does not ensure a functioning domestic market. So when stakeholders come and say they want certainty, one has to understand that the Internal Market Act does not provide that. The feature that I've drawn attention to, this is not a bug. This is not something hidden away. The Act is a crude, clumsy and undemocratic attempt to constrain devolution, and it's one that masquerades as an internal market regime. Now, this is not just the position of the Scottish Government, it's not just the position of the Scottish Parliament. I'm sure you've, amongst your deliberations, had a very, very close look at what one of our country's most preeminent legal minds, Lord Hope, has had to say on the subject, and others, and we are of exactly the same mind about the Internal Market Act, about what it is and how it does not replicate that which the European single market did, and it is missing, amongst many other things, it is missing that key principle of proportionality and subsidiarity. Thank you,
Cabinet Secretary. If I could ask one more question. You mentioned our previous report in 2022. In that, the UK Internal Market Act, we recognise that common frameworks have the potential to resolve the tensions within the devolved settlement through managing regulatory divergence on a consensual basis while facilitating open trade. Is there any evidence that this potential can be realised? And is there really an opportunity to improve how the Act works in relation to common frameworks as part of this review?
So the first thing, Convener, and I think we've discussed this already at committee and in debates in the Chamber, understanding that common frameworks were created as the solution to this challenge in the first instance, but were never allowed to become the primary working vehicle to deal with this challenge. Instead, the Internal Market Act, this Trojan horse into the devolution settlement, was introduced and eclipsed what the common frameworks were designed to do, and effectively stifled, held back their development as the agreed, preferred way of managing the single market in the United Kingdom. And members, perhaps not all on the committee, will have heard me already give an example where I told colleagues about my example shortly after taking up office in discussions with the UK Cabinet Office, and the Cabinet Office Minister at the time was Chloe Smith. And there was an encouragement that we should speak with one another about common frameworks because things were not progressing. The Scotland Office at that time, we all know the role that the Scotland Office played at that time, and for them it was all about the Internal Market Act, and it was about muzzling devolution. And Chloe Smith and I agreed that common frameworks were there to serve a purpose, that we both were committed to trying to make them work, that we didn't understand why they had not progressed as they might, and we committed that they should, and that we would come back within a matter of weeks to identify whether our officials had been able to make progress. To which the answer was yes, and that is exactly what happened. So I reflect on my personal experience in office, that where goodwill exists, the common frameworks are able to work if they are understood and treated in the way and the spirit in which they were created. Now, the UK government's consultation document proposes making frameworks the key mechanism for managing regulatory cooperation. That is fine in so far as it goes, except the Internal Market Act will remain and can be used in ways which will undermine that. So I do not understand how, if one is saying that one wishes to have a reset with devolved governments and parliaments, and there is an agreed position by the legislatures in Scotland and Wales on this, that the UK government would not even consult on the position that their own colleagues in those parliaments had voted for, I find utterly extraordinary, which is why we have provided the position paper that we have to outline our position on this. I wish the common frameworks well. We'll try and make them at work. It does not resolve the issue of the Internal Market Act remaining in place, and the excuses for it doing so are fatuous. There's absolutely no requirement whatsoever for them to remain, and I would encourage the UK government to embrace the common frameworks and to repeal the Internal Market Act in line with the position of this government, this Parliament, the Welsh Government and the Welsh National Assembly and Senate.
Thank you very much. Cabinet Secretary, I want to move to questions from members, and I'll bring in Mr Kerr.
So, Cabinet Secretary, you spoke about goodwill. Having received the document last night and having listened to you this morning, you're incredibly dogmatic. Absolutely no compromise. Dogmatic, straight down the line. This is not goodwill on your part at all, is it? This is bullying. This is what you This is what you want, and you must have it. And that's inconsistent with the evidence that this committee has received. Because you claim, and I think it's a grandiose, extraordinary claim, that this Act is the greatest threat to devolution that's ever existed. I think you use it simply as your latest weapon in your constitutional warfare with the United Kingdom. But what we've heard in this committee is business leaders, farmers, legal experts. They've all testified that the Act brings stability, legal certainty and confidence for investment. So let me ask you outright, is the Scottish Government's opposition to UKIMA really about the outcomes, or is it all about posturing and optics?
So I listen to Mr Kerr regularly in the Chamber talking about speaking in defence of the Parliament. And in many of those contexts, I don't agree with the point that he is making. But when it comes to defending the position of the Parliament in this question, apparently that is dogmatic. I reject that. It's been the position of this government, this Parliament, our Welsh colleagues and the Welsh Senate. So it is a mainstream opinion, a mainstream concern, as I already mentioned, a concern that was directly addressed by Lord Hope and others, not a member of this government or the governing parties. In fact, he's a member of no party as far as I'm aware. And I would also draw the committee's attention, if people haven't, to by the contributions by the late Donald Dewar on the question of the devolution settlement that was passed in relation to this question. I've listened very closely to the evidence that's been provided by business organisations to this committee. They're clear what they want to see. They want to see a regulatory environment that fosters clarity and certainty. And they're equally clear that what they don't want to see is a confused and uncertain regulatory environment. And the Scottish Government wants to see those outcomes for businesses as well. But I would make this point. Other countries manage to ensure a properly functioning internal market while recognising and protecting local powers and responsibilities. They manage it. Defenders of the Internal Market Act have to explain why that is somehow impossible in the UK. And that is the point where there is unhappiness on the part of both the Scottish Government and the Welsh Government that the UK Government has overlooked, would be the most charitable way of putting it, the position of both the Scottish and Welsh governments and parliaments, who voted for the repeal of the Internal Market Act, and in having a review of options, chose to exclude that. One could have considered it. Theoretically, one could have considered it and then concluded that that wasn't the route that they would take. But to exclude it from the off, I think, is more a reflection on the position of the UK government than anybody else. I'm doing my job in defending the position of this Parliament and the position of this government in recognising that common frameworks are a constructive way of working together. I've given an example of investing in that process myself. What I won't do is accept the continuation of something which is damaging to the devolution settlement, damaging to this Parliament, and is absolutely and totally unnecessary.
Well, I'm going on the evidence that was presented before this committee. I'm going on the words of businessmen, business people, business organisations, companies that actually want the legal certainty that UKIMA gives them. For example, let me take the Scottish Retail Consortium, talking about how Scottish consumers benefit enormously from open and frictionless trade with the United Kingdom. Or NFUS, who described England as by far the most important market for Scottish agriculture and the importance of having certainty and legal underpinnings for that marketplace. CBI Scotland, The UK internal market underpins economic growth and investment stability. None of these witnesses, none of them, advocated for the repeal of UKIMA. Now, I'm not going to sit here, Cabinet Secretary, and try and pretend that UKIMA is the perfect piece of legislation, nor am I someone who doesn't think there's vast rooms for improvement in the way that governments work together on our little island. But I have to say to you that the evidence that we've had as a committee is not as dogmatic, not as unilateral as your document is. Aren't you just actually speaking for nationalism when you say that you're sticking up for one thing or another, rather than sticking up for Scottish businesses and Scottish jobs?
So unsurprisingly, I don't agree with Mr. Kerr, who I think is confusing the outcomes that I think we both share in wanting to make sure that there isn't there aren't detrimental approaches to managing the single market in general, and he's confusing that with support for the Internal Market Act. I'm unaware of evidence presented by the organisations that he quotes saying that they require the Internal Market Act to stay in place. I would be very grateful to see that. My officials haven't provided me with that, if that was indeed evidence provided to this committee. But I'm unaware of that evidence being given to this committee. Those organisations have not, in terms, said that they wish the retention of the Internal Market Act. I think what everybody is agreed about is that one wants to have certainty about how one manages the Internal Market Act at the internal market. And as I have said to this committee, and as the position paper makes clear, and it is the position that we share with the Welsh Government, that the common frameworks are the way to do that, and that the Internal Market Act is not required to provide certainty. In fact, uncertainty is actually being catered for by the Internal Market Act in ways that causes concern through a long list of potential interventions, leading businesses to be uncertain about what the outcomes are. So actually, it's the obverse of what Mr. Kerr is presenting to the committee in his question. The uncertainty is actually caused by the Internal Market Act rather than common frameworks that I think most mainstream commentators would agree is the best way to proceed.
Well, that's...
Oh, sorry, just to update the record of the committee, I think it's quite helpful. I'm reading here, I quote, "It is the clear view of the National Farmers Union of Scotland that the principles now embedded in the UK Internal Market Act, IMA 2020, I'm continuing to quote, Convener, pose a significant threat to the development of common frameworks and to devolved policy." So I agree with the National Farmers Union of Scotland on that. That was evidence provided by them. So I rest my case that I think there is a way of approaching the single market where I think we're all agreed that we want to see that working as well as possible and providing certainty for business. The Internal Market Act should not play a part in that.
Well, I explicitly asked the witnesses that have come before this committee whether they wanted it repealed. You can look at the official record. It's very clear. We can swap quotes from the official report if you want. I can tell you, having sat through all of those hearings, that business people in Scotland appreciate the legal certainty that UKIMA has given them. Now, let me move on to a different issue, if I might, and that's the effect of UKIMA on the ability of devolution to work in terms of there being the opportunity to create innovation in innovation. Again, looking at what the legal experts told us, the academic experts told us, let me just share a couple of quotes from Chris McCorkindale. Professor McCorkindale is an advisor to the committee, and perhaps you would like to comment on these. UKIMA does not impose new legal limits on devolved competence. It simply ensures devolved laws don't create barriers to trade. And Angus Robertson just said that we agree that there ought not to be new barriers, or in fact we want to have frictionless trade across these islands. So Chris McCorkindale, Professor McCorkindale, University of Strathclyde, that's what he said. He went on to say the effect of the Act is practical. Scottish legislation is only enforceable against local goods and services, not those coming from elsewhere in the United Kingdom. Don't think there's anything unreasonable about that. That's what the effect of UKIMA is. I've got another quote somewhere in here which talks about, I know that, oh, here we go. This is David Thompson from the Food and Drink Federation. He said, we do not necessarily observe that the Internal Market Act has had a chilling effect. He was referring to devolved policy making and innovation in policy at the Scotland level. The problem here is, I think with Angus Robertson, if I may say to you, Cabinet Secretary, I think Angus Robertson's position, convener, is that he doesn't accept the nature of the unitary state of the United Kingdom. That is the fundamental stumbling block here, that the United Kingdom Parliament should not be able to legislate to create legislation that gives legal underpinnings to the internal market, because here is academic and legal opinion that clearly defies everything that he has said this morning.
So, convener, I have looked very closely at what evidence has been presented to the committee, and I would wish to highlight a few which I think are relevant to my considerations. One of the most preeminent experts in the country, Professor Nicola McEwen, wrote, and I quote, that the Act has, and I quote, already had a constraining impact on the devolved government's policy ambitions. She noted that, and I quote, the UK government should recognise and address that if it is to achieve a meaningful reset in its relationship with the devolved governments. Alcohol Focus Scotland said that the Act, and I quote, substantially undermines devolved regulatory autonomy and limits the ability of devolved governments to implement measures to improve public health. NFU Scotland has warned that the Act, and I quote, drives a coach and horses through the principles of common frameworks and almost renders them redundant and has the potential to undermine the devolved nature on agricultural policy. Scottish Environment Link calls the Act, quotes, entirely unfit for purpose and that it works directly against the principles of devolution. It warns of, I quote, years of inertia, delay and uncertainty if the Act's impact on devolution is not addressed. And the Scottish Crofting Federation said that they, in quotes, fear that the proposed legislation will lead to a race to the bottom, threatening our high standards in food, environment and animal welfare, thus damaging the image of Scottish produce. They noted that, and I quote, our Parliament needs to retain control over agricultural support as enshrined in the current devolution settlement. So, I think the evidence that has been provided is very, very clear on this subject. I've said it before and I will say it again. The Scottish Government supports the efficient, effective working of a single market in the United Kingdom, which involves proportionality and the other measures which I outlined in my opening statement. The good news is that we have a way of doing that. And in principle, we have agreement that that is the best way to do it, that is using common frameworks. That is the position of this government, that is the position of this Parliament, and it is the same in Wales. It is my job as a minister answerable to this Parliament that I stand up for its position, and its position is that the Internal Market Act should be repealed, and the evidence that we have from external stakeholders is absolutely clear on the issue. Let's concentrate on making common frameworks work. That's the way to do it, because apart from anything else, devolution is, of course, at its heart about being able to make different policy. It is about being able to innovate. It is about being able to make different choices. And if we have legislation in place that drives, to use the words of others, a coach and horses through the principles of common framework and, by extension, devolution, that is not acceptable. That's why our position is that the UK government should respect the views of this Parliament and and the Welsh Parliament as well, Welsh Senate, in including consideration of the repeal of the Internal Market Act and investing all of our efforts in making the common frameworks work to the ends that I think all of us, including Mr Kerr, are agreed should be the case across the United Kingdom.
I just believe that you've created...
Can I just say, we've now covered half an hour of allotted time. We know the Cabinet Secretary is short of time. I will bring you back in if time allows, but I'm going to bring in some other members.
Oh, I can't continue?
No, to be fair to the other members, I will give them an opportunity to come in, and we'll come back to you, Mr Kerr, if time allows, but we all know what the time constraints are this morning. Can I bring in Mr Harvey, please?
Convener, and can I just put on record apologies for being a few minutes late and missing the Cabinet Secretary's initial remarks. It's probably not unknown for committee members sometimes only to hear the evidence they want to hear. And I'm bracing myself for our sessions when we agree a committee report, but I'm confident the majority of the committee will reflect the balance of the evidence that we've heard. I've heard people giving us evidence that supports and which departs from the Scottish Government's position. I think there's a range of evidence that we've heard, and I want to reflect on it all. I'd like to ask two things. First, about the Scottish Government's position, and then about your understanding of the UK Government's position, because the latter is, you know, I might regret this, but the latter is more likely to direct where we get to with all of this. Now, you're suggesting that not only that the Internal Market Act itself is unnecessary, and I would be comfortable with that proposition, but that the common frameworks, the arrangements of that, the architecture of that is adequate, and we should rest on that to ensure that, you know, market access and so on. I recognise that the Internal Market Act constrains the power of the Scottish Parliament and the Scottish Government. Isn't it equally arguable that common frameworks constrain the power of the Scottish Parliament because they are subject to agreement between governments? You know, the Internal Market Act might have been a tolerable way forward if it had been co-legislated, if this Parliament had an opportunity to debate it, to amend it, to decide whether it agreed to it, if that had been a joint piece of work between two jurisdictions, there might have been an agreeable way forward. That hasn't happened with common frameworks either. Common frameworks, do they not constrain the power of Parliament and give a little bit of unaccountable power to governments? Is there a way in which you could see common frameworks evolving to ensure that the bulk of the authority and the power rests with the Parliament, which is the body ultimately that the Scottish people gave that authority to when they created this place?
So, with your indulgence, Convener, it's my first opportunity to say to Mr Harvey how sorry I am to hear his announcement that he is to stand down. He has led his party with distinction,
Very kind.
I think, over some years now. I can't remember exactly how many they are, Mr Harvey,
number.
but I think it's important to recognise Mr Harvey's service. So, Mr Harvey asked a very interesting question, and it is about how does one reconcile the operation of intergovernmental agreement, whether those are in the form of treaties or in rolling ongoing arrangements of intergovernmental relations, and how does one involve parliaments in that process? And I do think it is a good question. I've lost count, Convener, of how many times I've come to this committee. I think committee members know that I'm perfectly happy to come here as often as you would wish to hold me and the government to account in the area that I have responsibility for. So I have no objection to coming back here for detailed sessions about how our common framework's working in this area or other areas. it's not for me to answer for how they would allow themselves to be held to account in their parliaments. But I'm very keen, especially given the fact that it is the position of this Parliament that one wishes the common frameworks to work, to be answerable to you about the extent to which we are able to do it and the progress of all of that. So I have no objection to that whatsoever.
The point I'm making, though, is that Parliament needs to be able to do more than ask questions, even more than get answers to questions. And while there is an agreement across the Parliament that the common frameworks architecture should be made to work, individual common frameworks are not put to Parliament for debate and scrutiny and amendment. And once common frameworks have been agreed between the governments, that effectively constrains the ability of Parliament to legislate. So is there not a similar query, a similar question to be asked about the common frameworks architecture and where parliamentary authority and the right to decide lies, a little bit in the same sense that there's a massive unanswered question about the right of devolution to decide in the context of the IMA?
Yeah. Yeah. I want to rest where I answered before, Mr. Harvey, in signalling to the committee that I want to be as forward-leaning as I can about making common frameworks something that are, and the development of them is something that involves Parliament as part of the process, holding the government to account. And it's not for me to restrain parliamentarians in their use of the chamber and the ability that one has to debate issues and to decide on issues. And I'm signalling to Mr. Harvey that I want Parliament to be involved in processes around the common frameworks. And I mean, I think the question is that the timing of it is good, because we are beginning to see common frameworks get up and running effectively across the policy areas. Now, some of this is exceptionally dry and may not, one may have a very busy programme in the committee and not want to, discuss every meeting of committees that are dealing with issues under the common frameworks, but occasionally there will be. And there will be issues that come along. We know we have had them in the past, issues that relate to the single market. I've said before that I think the introduction of minimum unit pricing would be a very good example of that, an area where I fear that, sorry, I should say for the uninitiated, that was something that happened while Scotland and the United Kingdom were within the European Union. That one had the ability to introduce policy divergence on a public health measure, where I fear that the application of the Internal Market Act had the minimum unit price proposal been made, would have been blocked. Now, Can I foresee that there will be issues that come along that are of such importance in the future? Absolutely. And it therefore follows that parliamentarians, the committees of the Parliament and the Chamber as a whole will wish to be seized of that because they are of significant importance. And so I'm signalling to Mr. Harvey today and to the committee that I agree, that I think the Parliament needs to be involved. And I'm happy to work with the committee, as I have been on the likes of Scotland's continuing alignment with the European Union to make sure that that works.
Thank you. The minimum unit pricing example actually leads on quite well to the last question I was going to ask, which is moving on to the UK government's position, or at least, Cabinet Secretary, your understanding of the UK government's position. As a Green politician, I'm well used to having to hold fast to the true vision of what I believe in, but at the same time recognising that there's not going to be a majority for it, and I have to compromise and figure out how close can I get to it. I'm not going to suggest that you shouldn't advocate, and in fact, I'll probably advocate for a lot of what's in this paper about the architecture that ought to be there. But we know in reality that the UK government, the current UK government, seems unlikely to scrap the IMA, may not even make major changes to it. So I'd like to ask you about your attitude to some of the specific propositions for change that some of our witnesses talked about, like an explicit list of criteria for exemptions, which would have enabled, if it had been taking place under the IMA, the minimum unit pricing would have been able to argue it aligns with a specific exemption criteria. Or a shift in the burden of proof, so that the default expectation is the right for devolved legislatures to act, and the UK government would have to come forward with a sufficient burden of proof if it wanted to constrain that. These kind of more modest changes wouldn't go as far as I want, they wouldn't go as far as you want, but if they are achievable, what will the Scottish Government's attitude be to that? And do you think politically they are achievable, given the discussions you've had so far with UK colleagues?
So thank you very much, Mr Harvey, for the question, and it would be helpful to colleagues. I most certainly would not want to read all of this into the record because it would take far too long. But the annex to the Scottish Government's position paper on this question goes into considerable detail about the regulatory systems in place in, amongst others, Switzerland, Australia and Canada, and explains how one manages systems there. Mr Harvey is alluding to the point that I was making before about ensuring that the system in place surely must reflect proportionality and balance. Now, he also asked me, what is the position of the UK government? Do I have an understanding of where the UK government is with this? Which is saying, it seems to be saying two things at the same time. One, that they would wish the common frameworks to succeed, which I agree with. But two, that the Internal Market Act should be retained, and specifically for reasons relating to the Windsor framework. That's the reason that they've given. And that is frankly spurious. So it's not that. There are plenty of other ways of being able to do whatever one is needing to do in relation to the Windsor framework. One doesn't require the Internal Market Act to be retained in toto for that. So why then does one wish to retain the Internal Market Act? And I conclude it is because UK government ministers can imagine circumstances where they would wish to use the power to drive a coach and horses through devolution to stop something. They will work in the first instance to try and make common frameworks satisfy the processes, to be able to say one is respecting the devolution framework, that one has reset relations, that one is working in good faith. But somewhere in SW1, there is a fear that issues will come along where one would wish to override the devolution settlement using the Internal Market Act. That is the only rational explanation I have for its retention. Because if it is an agreed position that common frameworks are the appropriate way of dealing with things, and if everybody is agreed that it is not required for anything to do with the Windsor framework as the only way of satisfying that criteria, then that is the only logical conclusion that I can come to as to why it's being retained.
Thank you, Convener.
Thank you. Mr Adams, do you want to come in?
Yes, thank you, Convener. Good morning, Cabinet Secretary. It's funny how long I've been here. It never amazes me how we can all sit through the same evidence sessions and there can be such a vast difference on what the actual evidence came. Because when I look at the very first meeting that we had in March the 6th with the academics, Professor Thomas Horsley's evidence said the UK Internal Market Act framework was imposed without consensus from all the constituent parts. So that backs up a lot of what you've said here today, Cabinet Secretary. And the UK Government has a problematic role as both regulator and central gatekeeper, which is a key issue that a lot of people brought up in evidence as well. Professor Joe Hunt mentioned that the UK Internal Market Act hasty implementation without proper stakeholder consultation, top-down control that undermines devolution principles. So it goes on. The point I'm making, Cabinet Secretary, is it's amazing how when you sit through all this evidence, we can all kind of come up with different. But that's politics for you. People will do that. But for me, it's just the fact is, what I got from business in particular last week was the fact that they just want politicians to get on with it. Tell them what the rules are, tell them what the regulations are, but they see some problems with the UK Internal Market Act. They see the UK as a massive market, part of their business, but they just want us to get on with it. When I ask the question, do you not believe that politicians just get on with it, is working together to create the common frameworks in order to just come out, do exactly what Mr Harvey says, negotiate, come to a word that seems to be foreign these days throughout the world, but negotiate and come to some kind of compromise. Now, Cabinet Secretary, surely that's a sensible way to go about business, and that's a sensible way to do it. And the evidence that we've received actually backs that up.
Well, indeed it does, but there now are very, very few people, very few, maybe one in this committee, but very few people out there who are not agreed that common frameworks are the best way of proceeding. I mean, this is the common held view of the UK Government, the Scottish Government, the Welsh Government, the Scottish Parliament, the Welsh Senate, and I imagine the majority of parliamentarians in the House of Commons. Common frameworks is where it's at. The issue, though, is the retention of the Internal Market Act for all of the reasons and all of the concerns and the evidence that's been provided to this committee, and the absence of the UK Government to recognise that they should do what they promised in the run-up to the last UK general election, which was that they would repeal it. So, will the Scottish Government continue to invest its efforts in working collegially with other colleagues to ensure the effective workings of the single market, whilst at the same time understanding that devolution is about different policy making and potential different policy outcomes and potentially different policy priorities? It is a balance. And because of that divergence, there is a necessity to work out how does one make sure that one can do that with proportionality and balance, not with the ultimate muzzle and restraint that the Internal Market Act seeks to impose on elected democratic governments and parliaments in the UK. That is not what the devolved settlement was about, and I point again to the evidence of the then Secretary of State for Scotland, Donald Dewar, in the debate of July 1997 on this very question. It is germane, it is not theoretical, and it matters. And we are increasingly seeing a list of policy areas where the uncertainty that the Internal Market Act imposes is growing and growing and growing. And I think it's very disappointing that the UK government has not taken the opportunity, whilst reviewing, and it is a good thing to review, of course, how single market arrangements operate, but to exclude the agreed position of the government and parliaments of Scotland and Wales in this question.
And on that point, Cabinet Secretary, the evidence we've received as well has been the fact that the Act itself positions devolved governments as the junior partners. This has been said by, as we came here now, Mr Kerr seems to think that's a good idea for us to be the junior partners. But as you quite rightly said, that is not the way the devolved assemblies in Wales and the Parliament here in Scotland were set up. That's not the way that it was meant to be. We were told about this idea where we were actually meant to be equals within this whole process. You know, so I don't know if Mr Kerr said that Scotland should go back in its box, but surely we should be kind of looking to the history of this place and actually saying this is an attack against our Parliament by the UK internal market, particularly by the previous government, and who knows what the Labour UK government are going to do. I don't think they do.
Well, of course, Mr Adam is correct, and that is the position of this Parliament, which has voted twice for the repeal of the Internal Market Act. But I would prefer to invest my time and effort in making the common frameworks work, of the Internal Market Act being taken off the statute books, and get on with it, to paraphrase Mr Adam, of working together on the questions that are brought up by legislation in the rest of the UK, by legislation in Scotland, Wales and Northern Ireland, and to making the common frameworks the only route to doing so. Because apart from anything else, I think if the common frameworks are going to ultimately work, they have to be understood as the sole route of dealing with these internal market questions, and I think that would be a good thing. And I hope, even at this late stage, the UK government would reflect on their error, because it certainly doesn't reflect a reset, if that was the intention, that one would, and it having been pointed out that by excluding the position supported by Scottish Government, Scottish Parliament, Welsh Government and Welsh Senate, that most certainly would not be a reset. It would be a continuation of the last UK Government's approach to devolution.
Finally, Convener, one of the things that kept coming up was the exclusion process. Now, for me, we heard from Dr Brown-Swan. She highlighted the fact that the exclusion process lacks transparency, proper procedures, creating uncertainty and confusion for both legislators and business. Even those involved in business, Mark Strathy, emphasised that business face uncertainty, particularly around the exclusion process. So, is it not the case that the Act has created uncertainty for business instead of the certainty that it claims to actually do?
Absolutely, and just so. And this is part of the problem, and this is what should outrage democratically elected parliamentarians in this place, is that people not elected to deal with these matters can make these opaque decisions and run roughshod over the democratically elected representatives of this country. This is actually not that complicated an issue. We have a system in place that we have agreed we wish to make work. Why don't we just get on and do that? And why don't we bin that which we have commonly agreed is not fit for purpose?
Thank you.
Thank you. Mr Bibby?
Secretary, obviously we know the importance of the UK internal market to Scotland and the whole of the UK, and in terms of there may have been different views about the UK Internal Market Act within the evidence, but the strength of opinion on the UK internal market, I think, was pretty unanimous. For example, we heard from the Scottish Retail Consortium saying Scottish consumers benefit enormously from open and frictionless trade. NFU have said UK internal market is critical to the interests of Scottish agriculture, and it's vitally important for food and drink sector. It underpins, and Maggie Simpson from the CBI said our biggest customer in England is England, so anything that creates barriers to that trade is not going to be helpful. We know from 2021 so that exports to the rest of the UK were estimated to be over £48.6 billion. I just wanted to, obviously there is a balance to be struck between potential regulatory divergence and about protecting that internal market. That is all, it's always been and always will be a difficult balance to strike. In terms of, I just wanted to know, just in terms of the wording that's been used there about openness and frictionless trade from the Scottish Retail Consortium, about anything that creates barriers to trade from the CBI, and the Scottish Government's position of no unnecessary barriers to trade, it would be helpful for more of an outline to be set about the Scottish Government's decision to use that terminology and what you mean by that terminology. Because if you say no unnecessary barriers to trade, that suggests there could be necessary barriers to trade. And there may be issues, of course, you know, rodent glue traps and things like that, that have such a small economic impact that it doesn't make much difference. But I just wanted to hear a bit more about necessary versus unnecessary barriers to trade from the Scottish Government perspective.
Well, that opens up a very long conversation, I think, Mr Bibby and the committee, and for the academics in this area. So let's go back to minimum unit pricing of alcohol for a second, as an example. Now, of course, at that time, the decision to introduce minimum unit pricing was opposed by the Scotch Whisky Association. And they argued that the introduction of minimum unit pricing on alcohol was unnecessary and ran counter to the interests of the industry. Now, I speak as a great supporter of the Scotch whisky industry. On this question, however, I think they were wrong. Why? Because there was a view at the time, and I agree, that there was a public health necessity to find a range of interventions, including minimum unit pricing, to deal with excessive alcohol or harmful alcohol consumption. Now, one person's public health intervention, which is necessary, it was argued then, is another person's unnecessary intervention in the free and unfettered working of the market. Now, this is I just say this as an illustration of there will always be a tension between those who wish no intervention and those who can understand that there are reasons why there should for different policy outcomes. One person's safeguard is another person's red tape. And this argument will go on forever. And we are always trying to find the balance. And that's why I'm suggesting to Mr Bibby, it's not a simple issue to give a simple answer, but we, as the custodians of how devolution should operate in its current guise, have been charged with responsibility for a range of devolved policy areas of responsibility. And it may well be that this or future governments seek to make decisions on, amongst other things, public health grounds, environmental grounds or others, which some people in the private sector might see as being disadvantageous to them. Should we always try and strike a balance? Yes, of course, there has to be. And this is the point about proportionality and balance, whilst recognising that the point of devolution is being able to make policy that is different.
I thank the Cabinet Secretary for that answer. I appreciate it's not a simple issue to deal with, and there's no simple answers. In terms of the other evidence we received, and I'm sure we would, I think be interested to get your thoughts on this, because the Scottish Retail Consortium have said that our experience in the devolved nations indicates the Act has an effect on regulatory policy in those nations, eventually encouraging a more considered approach. And I just wondered if you agreed with that. And
so, I mean, I suppose that reflects the answer that I gave to Mr Harvey. I mean, I'm in favour of as much reflection and as much of an informed understanding of this issue going forward. I think it's in all of our interests to do that. But, sorry, I'll come back to that if Mr Bibby has any follow-up to that. There's maybe a supplementary to the point that the last question that he raised to me. I omitted to point out that the Internal Market Act is unique in not allowing for any consideration of non-economic policy outcomes. Now, herein lies the challenge, because policy divergence and devolution is about the full range of responsibilities of this Parliament. Unfettered. Unfettered. Yet we have an Act which will only make decisions on that relating to the economic consequences of that. And if one looks, for example, at the operation of the internal market, their entire locus is economic. It's not on public health. It's not on environment. It's not on any of these other questions which are devolved. And this is the point that I've been trying to make consistently around the understanding of proportionality and balance. Incidentally, something that happened within the European Union, but under the Internal Market Act does not happen within the United Kingdom. We have a responsibility to think about all of these other policy areas when voting on proposals in the Scottish Parliament. And we have to work our way through the consequences of trying to make that work in relation to the common market in Great Britain. We haven't even touched on the consequences of a part of the United Kingdom being part of the single European market as well as the United Kingdom single market. Incidentally, something that we'll all be having to reflect on the basis of yesterday's announcement by the US President and what that means. Are we going to have another part of the United Kingdom which is going to be facing tariffs that other parts of the United Kingdom are not? I think having a system in place, the intentions of which were commonly agreed, is that where we should be investing our efforts to try and find our way through this challenge that Mr Bibby has identified, which is getting the balance. So there's a point about proportionality and balance when it comes to policy innovation, rather than having a simple, economically driven assessment, which many people fear is about tending towards the lowest common denominator as opposed to innovative policy that might lead to better outcomes in different places. But I think the bottom line in all of this is just understanding a really simple point, that 85% of the population and electorate in this state live in one constituent part of it. And unfortunately, many decision makers in that part of the United Kingdom think that they should reserve the ultimate right to be able to determine what policy should impact on us all. That is not what devolution is about.
Thank you, Cabinet Secretary. I also wanted to ask, in line with the guidance that the convener said earlier, and in the context of the UK internal market and its review, what lessons does the Scottish Government draw from its role and how it conducts itself in relation to the deposit return scheme and the reasons why an exclusion was not applied to that scheme?
So I would say that the biggest lesson of that is making sure that there is the greatest possible public understanding of proposals that are being made, and an understanding that people can apply legislation if they wish, which overrides the democratic wishes of this country's Parliament. That's the biggest lesson that I would take. The Scottish Government, I think, worked throughout that process in a way that tried to get the UK Government to operate in a respectful way, and unfortunately it did not. And that is going to always be the challenge that we have in a state where the central government views devolved parliaments and governments as being subordinate. There is no hierarchy of governments in the UK. There are devolved and reserved powers, but there is no hierarchy of governments. And if one government decides that it simply wants to overrule another because it doesn't like what it's doing, that is not the operation of devolution as it was proposed. and I will resist the temptation, Convener, of reading into the record Mr Dewar's position on that in the House of Commons, which is absolutely clear. This is the Governor-General quote. And I think all of us, notwithstanding whether we wish to see Scotland proceed to become a normal independent country, where we will be deciding on these things ourselves together with colleagues within the European Union. But I think, and this is where I am so disappointed about what the UK government has done with this, because I think Mr Bibby would understand, I think everybody would, all political practitioners would understand, that if one wishes to review the options for things, there is no reason why one would seek to exclude. And this is the thing that absolutely mystifies me about this UK government approach to the issue. It would have cost them absolutely no political capital whatsoever to consider the positions of the Scottish Government and Parliament, Welsh Government and Senate, and conclude something different. I would have hoped that they wouldn't, and would hope and hold out the hand to them today to say, please think about this again. But I just don't understand why one chose to send a signal that one just wasn't even prepared to consider it. That's not reset. That's not collegial. That's not having a proper working relationship, and totally avoidable. And having gone through the frankly appalling approach of the last UK government to its dealings with devolved governments and parliaments, and I know this to be so because, you know, I sat in the meetings with my colleagues from the Welsh Labour Party and from the Democratic Unionist Party in Northern Ireland and Sinn Féin. I mean, my goodness, 4 parties and significant differences between them, all of them on the same page when it came to how the last UK government operated devolution. Confrontational, non-collegial, bad faith. And we have an opportunity, and I'm still not giving up on resets and the better atmospherics about things, but I am very disappointed. I try and find mild expressions to say so. I am disappointed that the UK government has chosen to ignore the position of this Parliament, the government, and incidentally also Mr Bibby and his party.
Just in terms of that reset in relations, obviously since the change of government last July, the first visit the Prime Minister took outside of London was to Scotland to meet with the First Minister. Since then, ministerial colleagues, UK government ministers have met with Scottish government ministers, including yourself on a number of occasions. There is regular and good dialogue, I think, between officials as well. Do you not accept there has been that fundamental reset in relations, and that bodes well for common frameworks, common sense?
Well, I hope so. I hope so, Mr Bibby. But, you know, I don't want to fall out about the fact that the UK government has chosen to introduce a review and exclude the position that he represented and I both commonly represented in the Scottish Parliament. As I've made the point already, it would have cost them nothing to consider it as part of their review. Where he is right, though, is that there has been much that has happened since the last UK general election that would suggest that there is a change in direction. No doubt about atmospherics, absolutely none. But we're now getting to the pointy end of having to see what decisions are being made about things. This is one example where I'm sorry, I'm not hugely optimistic about what the exclusion of repeal of the IMA means in this particular area. We're yet to see what happens with the reset discussions with the European Union. We have worked very hard in good faith, and I'm pleased that the UK government has taken on board the priorities of the Scottish government in relation to those discussions. But we will have to wait and see with which political weight the UK government represents the priorities of the Scottish government in those negotiations with the European Union. So I would hope that reset means something more than meetings and atmospherics and the formal presentation of things being different. At some stage, it actually has to reflect decisions that are made and political capital that is spent on things. And I will continue to work to try and make that possible, which is why, incidentally, and I'll say it again, I do think, and even under the last government, there were examples where individual ministers were prepared to work in good faith whilst others weren't. And where that was possible, I was prepared to do that. Here we have a government saying that it does want common frameworks to work. Good. Let's try and do that. But please be under no illusions. The Internal Market Act is being kept on the statute book. It's being kept for a reason. And the only reason I can foresee for the Internal Market Act being kept on the statute book is for it to be used at some stage to overrule the workings of the devolution settlement. And that should concern us all.
One bit
Sure.
of time
No,
will come back in.
finished anyway,
Mr.
thank
Kerr, do you want to come back in?
I'm glad that Angus Robertson qualified his caricature of the previous UK government, because I think that working relationships on the whole between ministers and indeed between officials was on a par with what it is now. Are you denying that?
That's not the case.
You're disputing that?
I am disputing that,
I
yeah.
see. Right, fair enough. There is a necessary element of goodwill. You talked about goodwill at the beginning. You are expecting the Labour government to do your bidding. You want them to repeal the Act. The Act is not going to be repealed. It is acknowledged by evidence that legal underpinnings for the single market are an essential part. Common frameworks, it's not a choice. You can have legal underpinnings and you can definitely have and must have these common frameworks. And we haven't talked about intergovernmental relations, but I think, Convener, given the written evidence we have and what we've heard from the Cabinet Secretary this morning, I really don't have any more questions.
I've got a couple more questions, if that's okay, Mr. Robertson. The theme of a lot of the evidence we have heard is from business about knowing what the path is, knowing what the regulations are, and certainty. And that's good for all business. And previously, until very recently, and post-Brexit, the conventions of devolution were by and large respected by both governments. I'm going back to the Sewell Convention and the evidence we've taken on that and how it's been under strain since that time. So given that from that way forward into the UK Internal Market Act, when that position of not normally legislate has changed over the course of devolution, do you think there has to be more than just the convention and relying on relationships between the two governments to ensure a way forward? How would you achieve such an aim?
Well, this again would be something where international examples would be very illustrative, because most other governments that operate a devolution or a federal government model have very clear, some of them are constitutionally ordered processes to make sure that one couldn't have a government that takes office and then acts in bad faith, as the last UK government did, where working relations were, in general terms, appalling, and one would have guardrails about intergovernmental relations. By any metric, whether it's overrides of the Sewell Convention, having a look at the records of how difficult it was to make intergovernmental relations work, have a look about how many meetings were cancelled, have a look at how many meetings didn't even take place. Even in common frameworks, probably worth having a look at when different elements of that common framework were set up, how long it takes. These, I think, reflect whether these processes are working optimally. Others manage it. Now, I would counsel against a hope that good faith is guarantee enough for good governance. And I think having systems in place which have guardrails serve us all well, domestically and internationally.
So, in terms of devolution, from my experience of dealing with the Scottish people, what they're interested in are health issues, environmental issues, animal welfare issues. But we have heard evidence that this, well, a chilling effect. But effectively in the current system, do you see a way forward where the lowest common denominator of regulation isn't going to trump everything that the devolution settlement would have given options to in Scotland and Wales and Northern Ireland?
So, in some respects, we're in the foothills of post-European Union membership changes and operation of a Great Britain internal market, or UK internal market. And what started out around issues of single-use plastics and deposit return scheme and glue traps, a very small number of issues which for many people might see as being distant from their lives or from their priorities. It is true to say that there is an ever-growing list of areas where the potential imposition of the Internal Market Act or the non-delivery of common frameworks in those areas will have an impact. This is continuing. So, that all the more reason to try and get the certainty and agreement that stakeholders have suggested to the committee that they would wish to see. I agree. The uncertainty is because of whether the Internal Market Act will be applied in those areas. That is undermining certainty.
We've also taken evidence from the Office of the Internal Market Act. This is an office that has necessarily been set up as a result of UKIMA, and in that evidence we found that they are able to offer advice to both governments when it's requested, offer advice to businesses when requested it. It can compel either parties to take on board that advice. Do you think there is a space for an arbitrator with more powers to intervene when a deadlock situation happens to represent fairly the positions of both governments?
So, I should say the Scottish Government meets with the Office of the Internal Market, and our officials meet with one another. I have met with them. They have great expertise, and I believe that they are scrupulous in meeting their duty in an even-handed way, and that is important. But I'm sure that they would be the first to concede that their role is limited. It is limited to considering the economic and trade implications of any policy. So back to the point that I was making to Mr. Harvey about the very real example we had in the past of, for example, minimum unit pricing, were they today having a look at that as an issue, they would understand that and only be able to consider that in economic and trade terms when it was a policy innovation introduced for a public health purpose. So that kind of answers the question that, yes, it plays a role, but its limitations underline the point that it reflects a system which is not fit for purpose, because it has to consider things in the round, if anybody is to consider anything in the round. And on the point of an arbitrator, well, of course, we have an ultimate arbitrator. It's called the UK government. And it will make that decision regardless, and the examples show it to be so, regardless of what the position of this Parliament and the government of this country is. So that, to me, cannot be the ultimate arbitrator, because it is a party to the process. And it is, has shown in its actions that it's prepared to override democratic consent. So how that would operate, I know not. I go back to the positive ground where I have planted my flag, convener, which is to say common frameworks is commonly agreed to be the way in which we should make things work. Let's end the bad faith that there has been from the UK government by getting the Internal Market Act off the statute books. That's the position of this government, the position of this Parliament, and on a number of occasions having voted on it, having made that case, and it's a position of our Welsh colleagues as well. So I think I will end by reiterating the point, which is quite a simple one, which is we have a system, let's make it work, let's get that which is not helpful to intergovernmental relations and to the operation and devolution of the statute books.
I'm giving it a final opportunity for any final questions. No, I think that concludes our session this morning. Cabinet Secretary, can I thank you and Mr Page for your attendance at committee this morning. And I will now close the meeting.